By the morning of an election day, a lot of hard work has gone into the preparation and setup of the city's poll sites. Ramps and platforms have been installed, signs have been hung, and steps have been taken to ensure that every voter, regardless of disability, is able to easily and safely access their assigned voting areas. And the problem is, things change during the busy voting day. Chairs and other obstacles are accidentally moved into the accessible routes. Voting equipment gets bumped out of place, and signs are flipped around by the wind or blown down. Most of this happens unintentionally. But the fact remains that throughout the day, these changes lead to many poll sites becoming inaccessible for some voters.
In this video, we're going to talk about how to maintain accessibility of the polling sites throughout the day. In order to help you see areas of concern, try to see the polling place as a voter with a disability might experience it. Try to anticipate what issues they might have that you would normally overlook. Pay careful attention so that you'll recognize these common problems and know what to do when you see them.
The first concept we need to understand is the accessible route. The accessible route is a continuous, unobstructed path connecting all of the accessible elements and spaces at the poll site. It's the route that is the easiest and safest way for people who use wheelchairs, scooters, walkers, and even people pushing baby strollers to get around to everywhere they need to go to vote.
Exterior accessible routes always include the sidewalks and walkways leading to the accessible entrance and may include parking access aisles, curb ramps, and sometimes an exterior lift. Interior accessible routes will include corridors or hallways and doorways, plus certain aisles and clear floor spaces within the voting area. They may also include ramps, elevators, and platform lifts.
You can imagine the accessible route as a red carpet that begins at the spot where a voter arrives that allows them to get to every place they need to go to vote. It's usually shown as a dashed line on the schematic plan of the site that's in the site coordinates envelope, and it may be shown as a pair of dashed red lines leading through the voting areas on the floor plan. You'll notice that it connects the sidewalks and accessible parking to the entrance. From there, it goes down the corridors and into the voting area. Once inside the voting area, the accessible route leads to all of the various stops in the voting process, from the entrance to the information and translators tables, to the ED/AD tables, onto the BMD and the ADA privacy booth, then to the scanners and back out to the exit. This red carpet route has to be free from obstructions like steps, overgrown landscaping, trash cans, furniture, boxes, and anything else that might block someone who's trying to follow the accessible route. The accessible route doesn't have to be physically marked in any way, but it has to be provided and it has to be kept clear at all times. Although 4 or 5 feet of clear width is preferred, accessible routes must always be at least 36 inches wide, with one exception. They can narrow to as little as 32 inches for no more than 24 inches at a time. An example might be a doorway that is 32 inches wide or a place where a column narrows the route. This minimum width will allow someone using a wheelchair the opportunity to push themselves through the narrow space without hitting their hands or arms. But again, it can only be as narrow as 32 inches and can continue for no more than 24 inches at a time. If something movable narrows the width for more than that 24-inch segment, move the obstruction to provide the full 36-inch width along that part of the accessible route. If there's a disagreement or a question about how to interpret or apply this requirement, call the Board of Elections office. While you're checking the corridors, also check to make sure that all of the doorways on the accessible route are propped open with nothing blocking access or reducing the clear width below 32 inches. For example, make sure no one props open a door with a trash can, brick, or large stone. A prop door may be helpful, but if it's done with a trash can or anything else that's too large and that obstruction narrows the clear width, it is an obstacle itself. While this accessible route will have been set up at the beginning of the day, it is your job to walk the accessible route every 2 hours, using the ADA checklist to make sure it is maintained throughout the day, and to make sure these clearances are still provided. If you find anything obstructing the accessible route, move it immediately.
Like voters using wheelchairs who can follow the accessible route, Voters with vision loss, like me, will use what is called the circulation path. We cannot see the accessible route, so the circulation path includes the entire accessible route, but it's much bigger than just that. Usually, the circulation path includes all of the areas where voters can walk. It also includes the headroom above the walking surface up to the height of 80 inches. Many poll sites have protruding objects that are more than 27 inches above the floor where a cane can detect them, and less than 80 inches above the floor where they're above the voters' heads. If they're within the zone between 27 inches and 80 inches above the floor, and they hang off the wall more than 4 inches into the circulation path, they can be a problem. Places where headroom is less than 80 inches above the floor create similar problems for voters who have vision loss. These conditions must be identified with features that can be detected with a cane, such as fixed objects or orange cones provided by the Board of Elections to prevent accidental injury to voters with vision loss.
Just imagine that you are a voter who is blind and walking with a cane. A large coat rack or a protruding bookshelf that is hung high on the wall would not be cane detectable and could injure you. Some of the worst problems we found include big wall-mounted fire extinguishers, air conditioners hanging over the entrance walkways or ramps, stairways with open undersides, equipment brackets and controls in school gymnasiums, and pipes hanging too low in unexpected places. Sometimes we run into scaffolding that has large open areas near the ground that aren't cane detectable. Those open areas will need low horizontal straps or orange cones so that people don't mistake the openings for a walkway. If the problems were there when the poll site was surveyed for ADA barriers, the location of each of these problems should be marked on the floor plan or the schematic for a warning cone to be placed there. If you notice one that isn't identified on one of the drawings, go ahead and put something cane detectable under it.
If placing a cane detectable element like an orange cone under a protruding object would narrow the required accessible route to less than 36 or 32 inches wide, and there's no other solution to protect voters with vision loss, the schematic will indicate an accessibility clerk will be stationed there to warn people to watch their heads. As you're doing your maintenance rounds every 2 hours, make sure these features have not been moved and are still correctly protecting voters from these head and arm bangers. For what it's worth, the cones will also help voters who are looking down at their smartphones or just not paying enough attention to where they're walking.
Now that we know that the accessible route is clear from any obstructions and areas with low headroom and protruding objects are protected, we need to make sure that the electrical cords in voter areas are not tripping hazards. When the voting area is crowded, extension cords that cross voter areas may be hard to see, so they should always be covered with a thick mat or securely taped down wherever the voters can be expected to walk across them. It's also best practice to run any power cables outside of the 5x5 clear floor areas on the voter sides of the BMDs and ADA privacy booths to make turning around in those areas easier for everyone.
By paying attention to these important details, you'll be able to catch each of these kinds of problems and fix them throughout the day. Then we'll all be able to vote on Election Day.